friends, it's Hawk. Today I'm going to be doing a little intro guide to reading classics. So for those of you who don't know, I was an English literature major, so a lot of my reading of classics came from that, but also I just wanted to be pretentious in high school and even middle school, so I read a lot of classics in there, and I just wanted to share some tips that I picked up while I was, on this crusade to be pretentious. Editing Hawk here. Just want to clarify that those are the reasons that I had for starting, and I just wanted to be honest about that. I'm not saying that everyone who reads classics or wants to read classics is just doing it to be pretentious. That's not what I'm saying at all. Certainly some people are, but I just want to be honest because I didn't want to sound hoity-toity like, oh yeah, I was just reading them in high school because I was just so intelligent. Like, no, I was reading them because I wanted to act like I was more intelligent than the people around me, and I just wanted to be honest about that. So that's why I said that, not trying to put that on everybody. This is not to say that I think anyone needs to read these books. That's gonna be a point later, but I just want to preface it with saying that classics are not necessary reading, especially because a lot of them have antiquated ideas, and if that makes you uncomfortable, you're allowed. I'm gonna be the person that tells you that you're allowed to be uncomfortable by Mark Twain saying the N-word over and over and over again in his work. My first tip is to read books that you actually like. This is more for people who are just starting out. Later on, you might be able to, or might be inclined to, read genres or themes or settings that you may not necessarily find interesting. But when you're just starting out, you don't want to branch too far from what you already know and what you already find interesting. For instance, if you enjoy dystopian fiction, you're more likely to enjoy Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, and if you hate romance, you may not enjoy Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Just like lean into the things you already know you like from contemporary fiction and try to find those themes within classic literature. My next tip is to use audiobooks. I cannot tell you how much of a difference this made to me discovering the classics on audiobook, because a lot of times when you're reading, I'm an auditory learner, so this may not apply to you visual learners out there, but every time I start to read and it's like maybe a new author that I haven't read before or from a different time period that I haven't read in before, I just find it really difficult to get used to the language at first, especially when I was just starting out. It's a little easier for me now that I have a little more practice in it. I think that audiobooks and listening to the story being told is such a great way to get used to the language in the book. That's not to say you have to listen to the whole thing in audiobook. Personally, I like to, if I'm really like trying to be a good student or be a good reader, I will listen to the audiobook while I'm looking at the text so that like if anything is interesting to me I can still underline it and annotate it and such. But I cannot stress enough the power of audiobooks, especially considering a lot of these classic books are in the public domain, and so they have so many audiobooks that you can choose from to listen to in order to really engage yourself with the story. My next tip would be to start modern and work your way back. Now, this is not a perfect rule. I think that you should use discretion or other people's opinions if you look it up on the internet. For instance, Lolita, which I think was published in 1955, definitely the 1950s, is a much more difficult read than, say, Pride and Prejudice, which was published in the 1800s. So take this advice with a grain of salt, but I think as a general rule it works. The closer that you are to the modern way of speaking, the easier a book is going to be to get through for you. In other words, don't make Beowulf your first classic or the Canterbury Tales. This isn't to say that you should not read like the Iliad if you want to read the Iliad. The Iliad is great. I'm just saying that if your goal is to read the books that people consider classics and you want to start with that, I would recommend picking up books from the 20th century, then the 19th century, instead of, just trying to start from the oldest and work your way up. My next tip is a controversial one, but it is to watch the movie before you read the book. I know, this is like a cardinal sin to book people, but hear me out. Through the movie, you get to engage with the characters, you get to know who you like and who you don't, and have a general opinion going into the book. You have a base understanding usually of the plot, so it makes it a lot easier to know what's going on as you read through the book, especially when you're first starting out. It's a good way to know if this classic is worth reading to you. I mean, personally, I would recommend Pride and Prejudice 2005, but That's neither here nor there. My next tip is to read short stories. If you are put off by the idea of reading classic novels, there are so many authors who wrote classic novels who also wrote short stories. James Joyce wrote short stories, Ernest Hemingway wrote short stories, and he's a lot easier to take, in my opinion, in short story format. Fitzgerald wrote short stories, Leo Tolstoy wrote short stories. It's just so many authors wrote them, so it's going to be very easy for you to get used to the way they use language and translate that into reading their longer works. It also lets you know if you like the way that they write, because that is an underrepresented consideration when you're reading classics. I hate how Faulkner writes. I also hate how Hemingway writes most of the time, but I love how Fitzgerald writes, and that shows in his short stories. So it gives you a better idea of what you're going to be seeing going into a book. I would also say that this is true with plays. This is not as common, but for example, Oscar Wilde is much more known for his plays, so you can kind of get a sense of the themes that Oscar Wilde tends to write about through his plays. And also there are plenty of classic plays like, A Streetcar Named Desire, The Glass Menagerie, and they're all very easy to read, in my opinion. And the note that I want to end on is that there is no such thing as necessary reading. Don't let anyone shame you for not having read a single classic, the classics that you like. There's no necessary reading in real life. If you don't like something, you don't have to read it. It's more important that you are reading. The fact that you want to read classics at all, that's great, but it's not something that's going to make you smarter or more worldly or more educated than anyone else. So if you're doing it to be pretentious to your friends, I don't really approve of that use of this video. Don't let anyone make you feel inferior for what you have or have not read. So that's the note I want to end on in my tip portion of this video. I think I would be remiss if I did not offer suggestions of classics that you can read, good starter classics in my opinion that I have read that are a lot easier to grasp than some others. The first book, which I've already mentioned, is Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. This is a dystopian sci-fi book set in a future New World state where there is a sort of intelligence-based hierarchy. A lot of it is based on psychology and technological advancements. So if that is something that interests you, pick it up. The next book I want to recommend is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. This is probably my favorite classic, at least in my top 3. This is about, as you may have guessed, Dorian Gray, who at the beginning of the novel gets a portrait painted of him, and upon seeing the portrait and also hearing some interesting hedonist philosophy from this man, Lord Henry, he decides or exclaims that he never wants to age, that he wishes that this painting could take on all of his aging and sin and that he could stay beautiful forever. He gets his wish, and you see what happens in this novel. My next recommendation is Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. This is also probably one of my favorite classics, definitely in my top 3. This is about an unnamed narrator who is a black man. First, he's living in the South, and then he moves north, and it is about his experiences with racism in both of those avenues. If you read one book, make it this one, because this book is just so good, and I think a lot of people assume that if they're reading classics, they're going to be reading by white men or even white women, and this is an example of a classic that is written by a black man that is, oh my god, it's so freaking good. Even the best first chapter ever written. Most impactful first chapter ever written. So yes, pick this up. It was written in the 1950s, I believe, so it's following my kind of fake rule of start modern and go back. So good. So I tried to start with books that were a little off the beaten path, but I'm gonna end with books that you probably have heard recommended as starter classics a million times. The first one is going to be Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. If you don't know what this is about, I'm going to be very surprised just because it is saturated in the media for the most part. This is about the Bennet family, but more specifically Elizabeth Bennet. Her mother is trying to marry off all of her many daughters. It is a book about romance, as you probably know. Everybody loves Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy, but it is also a book about class. It's a very funny book. I know everybody harps on it, but it really is a great book. It really is entertaining, and it really is easy to follow, so this is definitely a book that I would consider starting with. And finally, I would not be me if I did not suggest The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. This book is small, It was written in the 20th century. It's exciting. The characters are awful. It's just a whirlwind. So this is about Nick Carraway, who moves to New York, and in so doing moves next to this man called Jay Gatsby, who throws these extravagant parties, and it is about him figuring out why this is happening. It is about him finding out about this man's past, and it's just a great novel. It's short. It's easy to read. The language isn't too difficult to understand. I think this is a really good start. Personally, it's one of my favorites. It's actually the classic that got me into reading classics, so what can I say? So those are all my tips and recommendations. I hope you guys found something useful in this video. Please let me know down below what your favorite classic is, if you have one, or what classic you'd like to start with, or if you have a question about any classics, if you're looking for something in particular, please let me know. I would be more than happy to help you. Thank you guys so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye!